My parents didn't like me, so I stayed away from them. When I went back, they embarrassed me. But when I told them about my company, they started treating me differently. As a child, the phrase family first was ingrained in my mind, yet my family life felt more confining than comforting. Born into a household that seemed designed for exploitation, I quickly learned my role was not that of a child, but of a laborer. Marjorie and Paul, my parents, viewed me not through the loving lens of parenthood, but as an asset to maintain their struggling farm. From a tender age, I was handed tools instead of toys, as the farm demanded my toil over any educational pursuits, which my parents dismissed as mere distractions. Situated on the edge of a town that time seemed to have forgotten, our farm was a relic of hope and neglect. Despite their constant claims of striving to preserve the farm, my parents exerted little effort themselves, relegating the brunt of the labor to me. My days began before the sun rose and stretched until it dipped below the horizon, filled with tending crops, caring for animals, and an unending list of chores. Inside the house, my parents occupied themselves with idle activities, barely interacting with the outside world except to exchange trivial gossip with a handful of neighbors. Being an only child, I had no siblings to share the burdens or the solitude. My earliest recollections are dominated by my father's stern directives and my mother's persistent complaints from her perch at the kitchen table, a cigarette always in hand. In that home, warmth and affection were foreign concepts. Our relationship was starkly utilitarian. I provided labor, while they provided the minimum sustenance and shelter. Any attempt on my part to seek respite or express dissatisfaction was swiftly quashed with scathing words, or at times, more severe consequences. The only solace I found was in school, though it was often deemed unnecessary by my parents and became yet another arena for conflict. My parents didn't want me to go to school. They tried to keep me home to work on the farm, but I insisted on going every day. I didn't initially go because I loved learning, though eventually I did, but because it was the one place where I wasn't just another worker. My teachers were the first to see potential in me beyond just being a farm boy. They noticed the signs of my tough life, my bruises, my constant tiredness, and the empty look in my eyes. Some teachers tried to help, but my parents were good at making excuses. They told the school I was just clumsy or that I tended to daydream, which they said was why I always seemed so tired. But at school, I wasn't completely alone. Despite my worn-out clothes and dirty hands, some classmates looked past that. Sarah, who had been my classmate since first grade, always had a smile and a kind word for me. Mike, the class clown, could make anyone laugh, including me. Then there was Mrs. Daniels, my fifth grade teacher. She did more than teach. She stayed after school to help me with my studies and even with personal issues. Mrs. Daniels made me feel valued beyond my work on the farm. She talked to me about a bigger world out there, about college and different careers, and about a life where I could be in charge of my own destiny. Her encouragement started to give me hope that maybe I could leave the farm life behind. As time went on, school became more than just a safe place. It became my way forward. I worked hard, not because I was the top student, but because I saw education as my way out. My parents never understood why I spent so much time studying or why I was so focused on graduating. They didn't care about grades or diplomas. They only cared about the farm and getting as much work from me as possible before I left, like an old, worn-out tool. As I grew older, life at home got worse. My father's temper became terrible, especially when he drank, which was often. My mother's constant complaining turned into real anger as I started to stand up for myself more. The physical beatings happened more often, and they always put me down, saying I was useless and would never leave the farm, that I'd end up like them. But I had different ideas. By my last year of high school, I was planning how to leave. I didn't have money, but I had something just as good: knowledge and friends. Over the years, I had made a few good friends who wanted to leave our small town as much as I did. Sarah was my best friend, and Mike, always the joker, was very loyal. Together, we made a bold plan. We decided to start a business using the one resource I knew well: wood. Our farm was next to a large forest that nobody used. I knew how to chop wood because I'd done it for our own needs. I also knew there was a demand for it in nearby growing towns. I spent many months learning all I could about the wood business. I'd stay late at the library, reading books and old magazines. I learned about different types of wood, the best times to cut it, and how to prepare and sell it. I even talked to some local wood mills, pretending I was older to get more information. But knowledge alone wasn't enough. I needed money to start. That's where my friends helped out. Sarah, who was always clever, managed to get her parents to invest a little money in our idea, promising them they'd see profits once we were up and running. Mike, good with his hands, brought along his truck and offered his help. I even got support from Mrs. Daniels, my teacher. She helped me create a business plan and taught me how to present it to potential investors. The day I finished high school was also the day I left my parents' farm for good. They didn't come to my graduation. They were too caught up in their own issues, but I was okay with that. I didn't need them. Right after the graduation, I went back to the farm, packed my things, and left without saying anything. I moved into Mike's place. He had a spare room. We started working on our business right away. The first few months were really tough. We were young, didn't have much experience or money, and sometimes I wondered if we had made a big mistake. I worried maybe my parents were right about me failing, but whenever I thought about quitting and returning to that awful farm, it drove me to keep pushing forward. We started off small, just me, Mike, and Sarah cutting and selling firewood locally. It wasn't a big operation, but it was a start. We often worked all night. Our efforts began to pay off. People started talking about our business, and soon we had more orders than we could fill. That's when we decided to grow. We put all our money together and rented a piece of land just outside the town. We invested in better equipment, hired a few workers, and began to handle larger amounts of wood. It was risky, but our hard work eventually paid off. Within a year, we became one of the top firewood suppliers in the area. By the second year, we were selling lumber to construction firms, and by the third year, we had deals with several big retailers. It wasn't easy, though. We faced lots of problems, like broken equipment and clients who tried to cheat us. Every time we encountered a problem, we figured out a solution. Sarah was brilliant with our finances, and Mike could fix almost anything. I took care of selling our products and managing the delivery details. Together, we were an excellent team. The day we earned our first $1 million felt like a dream. I still remember sitting in our small office, staring at the bank statement in disbelief and feeling so proud. I had made it. I had escaped a life that was meant to break me. More importantly, I had built something from scratch, something that was truly mine, something no one could take away. After that milestone, a lot changed. We moved to a bigger facility, hired more people, and started offering more products. We began selling not just wood, but also furniture and home items made from our wood. Our business grew more than I ever imagined. Mike bought his own house, Sarah launched a side business, and I continued to expand our company. As for my parents, I haven't talked to them since I left. I learned that their farm failed shortly after I departed, which didn't surprise me. They were never hard workers, just users. I guess I should feel bad about their situation, but I don't. They chose their path, and now they have to live with it. After the early success, my life kept improving. Our company had flourished, making significant strides in the lumber industry. Yet, as they say, the higher you climb, the harder you fall, a lesson I learned painfully. Trouble began a year after we upgraded to a larger facility. Our business was thriving, but soon we faced a daunting challenge. We couldn't keep up with the demand. Initially, the surge in orders was welcome. It meant more profit. However, it quickly became apparent that our wood supply was dwindling much faster than anticipated. The vast forests that surrounded our town, once thought to be inexhaustible, were nearing depletion. We had harvested nearly every tree within a feasible distance. The rising costs of transporting wood from distant areas were now severely impacting our margins. Sitting in my office one morning, I examined the financial reports, and the truth hit me. We were in a dire situation. The projections showed only about 2 months of wood supply remaining, after which fulfilling contracts would be impossible. Recognizing the urgency, I convened an emergency meeting with Mike and Sarah. The atmosphere in the conference room was tense. Mike attempted to break the tension with humor, but his concerned expression was unmistakable. Opening the discussion, I leaned in and said, "We have a serious issue on our hands." Sarah, ever practical and straightforward, responded immediately, It's the wood supply, isn't it? I confirmed her suspicion with a nod. Precisely. And unless we find a new source quickly, our business faces a crisis. Mike chimed in with a possible solution. Why don't we consider purchasing wood from other suppliers? I shook my head, knowing we were already buying wood from other suppliers, but the costs were becoming unsustainable. It's already expensive, and our margins are shrinking. Soon it won't be profitable at all. Sarah sighed, realizing the gravity of the situation. We need to expand our reach, maybe explore other regions or even look out of state. I had considered that option too, but there was a significant risk involved. That could work, but we have to be cautious. We're already under scrutiny from the local authorities. If we start logging in new areas without the right permits, they could shut us down completely. Right then, my phone buzzed with a message from one of our workers at the logging site. Boss, the police are here. They want to see our permits. My heart dropped. I quickly excused myself from the meeting and rushed to the site. When I arrived, I saw 2 police cars parked near the entrance and several officers speaking with our foreman Joe, who looked extremely anxious. One of the officers, a tall man with a stern expression, noticed me and walked over. Are you the owner? He asked. Yes, I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. What seems to be the issue, officer? The officer crossed his arms, looking at me intently. We received a tip that you've been logging without the proper permits. We're going to need to see your paperwork. My stomach tightened. While I was confident we were mostly in compliance, there were a few gray areas that could cause problems. I had a strong suspicion that this was exactly what the police were looking to exploit. Of course, I said with a forced smile. I'll need to head back to the office to grab the documents. It'll only take a few minutes. The officer didn't look entirely convinced, but nodded. We'll wait, he said. I hurried back to the office, my mind racing with worry. If the police found anything amiss with our permits, they could shut us down right then and there. I quickly searched through our files, pulling out every piece of paperwork related to our logging operations. By the time I got back to the site, the officers were already looking impatient. Here you go, I said, handing over the documents. Everything should be in order. The officer took the papers and started going through them. Each minute felt like it lasted forever. Finally, he looked up and said, Well, everything seems to be in order, though he sounded almost disappointed that he didn't find anything wrong. But we'll be keeping a close eye on you. Make sure you stay within the law. I nodded, feeling a wave of relief. Of course, officer. We always follow the regulations. He handed the papers back to me, gave a short nod, and then turned to leave. As the police cars drove away, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, but the whole experience left me shaken. The police were clearly looking for any reason to shut us down. If we didn't fix our supply issues soon, they might just get their chance. Back at the office, the mood was tense. I explained what had happened to Mike and Sarah, and we spent the rest of the day trying to come up with ideas, but no matter what we thought of, the same problems kept coming up. The high cost of transporting wood from other regions, the risk of legal trouble, and the dwindling supply. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept going back to the same thought. We couldn't do this on our own. We needed help. Someone with more resources and more connections. But who? The answer came to me the next day in the form of an unexpected phone call. It was from Dan Reynolds, the owner of a rival lumber company in the neighboring town. We had run into each other a few times at industry events, but we had never really talked. Dan was known for being tough, but he was also very successful. His company was one of the few that could compete with ours in the region. Hello? I answered the call, not sure what to expect. Hey, this is Dan Reynolds, said the voice on the other end, sounding both casual and firm. I heard you've been having some supply issues. My heart skipped a beat. How did he know? Where did you hear that? I asked. Dan chuckled. Word gets around, he said. Look, I know we're competitors, but I think we can help each other out. I was doubtful. How do you figure? I asked. I've got access to some great forest land, he explained. All legal, by the way. But I don't have enough workers or equipment to harvest it. You've got the opposite problem. Plenty of workers, but not enough wood. So, what do you say we team up? It was an interesting offer, but I wasn't sure if I could trust him. What's in it for you? I asked. Simple, Dan said. We split the profits 50-50. You handle the logging, and I'll take care of the permits and logistics. I hesitated. It almost sounded too good to be true. But then again, what other option did I have? If we didn't do something soon, we'd be out of business in a few months. All right, I finally said. Let's meet and discuss the details. We agreed to meet at a neutral place, a diner on the edge of town. When I arrived, Dan was already there, sipping coffee like he didn't have a worry in the world. He was a big guy, tall and broad-shouldered, with a no-nonsense attitude, but there was something about him that made me feel at ease. We talked for hours, going over the details of our partnership. Dan was straightforward but fair. He didn't sugarcoat anything, and he made it clear that he expected results. But he also made it clear that he was committed to making this partnership work. By the time we shook hands on the deal, I felt a cautious sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this would work out. The first few weeks of our partnership were challenging. In the beginning, we faced a lot of issues: miscommunications, logistical hurdles, and the inevitable clash of personalities. But over time, we began to find our groove. Dan's resources and connections unlocked opportunities we hadn't had before, while our team's skills and manpower made the most of his land. We hired more workers, upgraded our equipment, and boosted production. Soon enough, we were back on track, not just meeting our targets, but exceeding them. The police, who had been eager to find fault with us, suddenly had nothing to go on. We were operating strictly by the book, and they had no choice but to leave us alone. Just as things were looking up, however, disaster struck. One evening, as the day was ending, I received an urgent call from one of our workers at the logging site. There had been a serious accident. A tree had fallen the wrong way, trapping one of our workers underneath it. The paramedics were on their way, but it sounded bad. I rushed to the site, my heart pounding. When I arrived, I saw the worker, a young man named Tom, being placed on a stretcher. He was conscious, but just barely. His leg was badly crushed, and he was clearly in a lot of pain. I spoke briefly with the paramedics, who assured me they were doing everything they could. But as they drove away, a deep sense of dread settled over me. Accidents like this didn't happen often, but when they did, they were serious. The other workers were in shock, and I knew I had to address them. I gathered everyone together and tried to reassure them, saying that Tom was in good hands and that we would support him and his family through this. But I could see the fear in their eyes. Logging is a dangerous job, and this was a harsh reminder of just how risky it can be. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about Tom. I visited him in the hospital, where he was undergoing surgery to fix his leg. The doctors said it was too early to tell if he would fully recover, but they were hopeful. I assured Tom's family that we would cover all his medical bills and that his job would still be there for him if he decided to come back. But deep down, I knew that even if he recovered, he might never be able to work the same way again. The whole incident shook me to the core. It made me rethink everything. Were we taking too many risks? Was this business worth the potential cost of someone's life? I started questioning whether I was pushing my team too hard and whether I was prioritizing profits over their safety. I decided to share my concerns with Dan, and surprisingly, he took them seriously. Accidents happen, he said, but that doesn't mean we can't work to prevent them. We need to focus even more on safety, ensuring something like this never happens again. Together, we brought in safety experts, introduced new safety protocols, and invested in better training for our workers. It cost us a lot, but it was a necessary step. The well-being of our people had to be the top priority. Despite these challenges, our partnership continued to thrive. We encountered obstacles, but we faced them head-on, combining Dan's business savvy with our team's hands-on expertise. One of the biggest hurdles we faced was securing long-term contracts with larger retailers. The competition was fierce, and we needed something to set us apart. That's when Dan suggested something bold. "We need a slogan," he said during one of our meetings. "Something memorable, something that defines who we are and what we stand for." Sarah, who had recently become a full partner in the business, seemed skeptical. A slogan? You really think that will make a difference? Dan was confident. It's not just about what we sell. It's about how we present ourselves. People need to understand what we represent. We spent hours tossing around ideas, but nothing felt right. Then, just when we were about to give up, Mike, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up with a suggestion. How about do it for Dan? Mike suddenly threw in. We all looked at him, a bit surprised. What do you mean? I asked. Mike continued. Well, Dan is the reason we all got together. He helped turn everything around for us. It's like a tribute to him, our teamwork, and the success we've shared. Dan, who was listening, looked genuinely moved by Mike's words. He grinned, something rare for him. I like it, he replied. It sounds good. And just like that, do it for Dan became our informal motto. It began as a light-hearted remark, but quickly grew into something meaningful. The workers used it to motivate each other. Soon you could see the slogan on our trucks, uniforms, and even our business cards. It resonated with people more than we expected, giving our company a distinct identity and a clear purpose. We were no longer just any lumber company. We were a unified team, a family with a common goal. As our business expanded, so did our obstacles. We encountered legal issues, environmental protests, and tough competition. Through all these, we stayed tight-knit and supportive. One major challenge was a lawsuit from an environmental group accusing us of illegal logging activities. They alleged that we were damaging protected areas and harming wildlife. These claims were unfounded, but the lawsuit threatened to break us. We secured the best legal representation we could afford, though the costs were steep. The lawsuit dragged on, depleting our finances and morale. There were moments when it seemed we might not make it, that all our hard work might crumble. But Dan stood firm. We're going to fight this, he asserted with firm resolve. And we're going to win. And win we did. The lawsuit was eventually dismissed, and we were exonerated from all accusations. The relief was immense, but the victory was costly. The legal struggle had exhausted us all, and we were left wondering how much longer we could endure. Just when we felt completely overwhelmed, an incredible opportunity came our way. A major retailer reached out with a proposal to partner with us on a line of eco-friendly, sustainable wood products. This deal was a lifeline. It gave us the stability and resources to expand and truly establish ourselves as leaders in the industry. We grew our operations, hired additional staff, and even opened a second facility in a different state. Through it all, Dan was our guiding force, sharing his wisdom and shaping our strategies. He wasn't just a business partner anymore. He became a mentor and a central figure in our success. Yet, as our business flourished, I sensed a void. The initial excitement of starting up had dimmed, replaced by the routine of managing a sizable enterprise. The challenges had evolved too. They were no longer about survival, but about maintaining our achievements. Then one night, I got a call from Sarah that jolted me. Her voice was shaky as she said, I need to talk. It's about Dan. My heart sank. What happened? I asked. It's serious, she replied. Dan has cancer, and it's quite advanced. The news struck me profoundly. Dan had been the pillar of our group, always driving us forward. The possibility of losing him was devastating. I'm on my way, I said, grabbing my keys and heading out the door. I arrived at Dan's house in a daze, finding Sarah, Mike, and a few others gathered there. Dan was seated, looking frail, yet managing a smile. Hey, kid, he greeted me weakly. Turns out I'm not invincible. I forced a smile, though inside I was crumbling. Don't talk like that, I responded, taking a seat next to him. We're in this together. We'll fight it. Dan gave a gentle shake of his head. I've had a great run, he said quietly. But this might be the one fight I can't win. Silence filled the room, heavy with the reality of his words. We had faced countless challenges together, but this was something beyond our control, something we couldn't simply overcome. Over the following weeks, we all came together for Dan, helping in any way we could. We took turns visiting him, running errands, and making sure he was comfortable. Despite our efforts to stay upbeat, we all understood the grim reality. Dan was fading. One evening, after a particularly tough day, Dan summoned me to his room. He appeared frailer than ever, yet his gaze remained intense. "I need you to promise me something," he said in a hushed tone. "Anything," I responded, my voice choked with emotion. "Promise me you'll keep the business going," he urged. "No matter what happens. Do it for Dan, okay?" I nodded, struggling to hold back tears. "I promise." Dan passed away a few days later. His death created a deep void in our lives and within the company, but I kept my promise. We all did. The business continued to expand, but it never felt the same without him. We dedicated our efforts to his memory, and Do It for Dan evolved from a slogan to our core principle. Reflecting on our journey, it's astonishing to consider how much we achieved, moving from the edge of collapse to becoming industry leaders. It was a path marked by obstacles, victories, and profound sadness. But we never stopped. We kept fighting, pushing forward, doing everything for Dan. I believe Dan would be proud of what we built together. After years of success and building my own life, I began to feel a pull toward the past, a need to address unfinished business. My success had brought me confidence, and maybe a part of me sought closure. One evening, after a lot of thinking, I decided to visit my parents. I wondered if enough time had passed to heal old wounds. Maybe they had changed. And perhaps, just maybe, they would see me as more than the free labor they once used. Driving back to the town where I grew up felt surreal. The landscape was familiar, yet everything seemed different, smaller somehow. My heart raced as I neared the old, dilapidated farmhouse where I had spent so many tough years. The house looked even worse than I remembered, with peeling paint and a sagging roof. I parked the car and took a deep breath, preparing myself for what was ahead. When I knocked on the door, there was a pause before I heard movement inside. The door creaked open, and there stood my mother, Marjorie, looking as harsh and worn out as ever. Her eyes widened in surprise. "Well, look who it is," she sneered, her voice full of sarcasm. "The prodigal son returns. What do you want?" My stomach knotted up, but I managed to smile. "Hi, Mom. I just thought I'd stop by and see how you and Dad are doing." She narrowed her eyes, her face lined with suspicion. "Why now? It's been years. Did you finally remember you had parents?" Before I could answer, my father, Paul, appeared behind her, his expression stern. "What are you doing here, boy? Haven't seen hide nor hair of you since you took off." It was obvious that the resentment I left behind had only grown in my absence, but I was determined to face it. "I came to see if we could move past our old issues," I cautiously stated. My mother's laughter was bitter and devoid of any warmth. "Move past? After all the trouble you caused? You were nothing but a burden, always complaining, always idle. You never appreciated what we did for you." Anger surged within me, but I suppressed it. "I worked tirelessly for this family. I fulfilled every demand you placed on me," I asserted. My father's voice then cut through, harsh and cold. "You wasted time at school when you should have been here working. You were a disappointment to this farm." I clenched my fists, fighting to remain calm. "That's not the way I remember things," I responded softly. "But discussing the past isn't why I'm here. I've changed. I've built a successful business for myself." Mentioning my success sparked a change in their attitudes. Curiosity replaced the scorn in their eyes. "A business?" my mother asked, her interest piqued. "What kind of business?" I paused, knowing their potential reaction. "I run a lumber company. It's quite successful. We've grown significantly, secured major retail contracts." My father suddenly chimed in, his tone now sycophantic. "Really, son? That's impressive." A smile cracked across my mother's face, one that seemed forced and unnatural. "Why don't you come in? Let's talk more." I knew better, but part of me hoped for their approval. I followed them inside, the house heavy with unease. We sat at the old kitchen table, and for a moment, they seemed genuinely interested in my life. I shared stories about the company, about my partners Dan, Mike, and Sarah, and how we turned our struggles into success. Yet, as I spoke, I noticed a calculating look in their eyes. That gleam in their eyes made my stomach turn. It wasn't pride or love, but sheer greed. You know, my mother began, leaning in as if sharing a secret, we could help you with the business. You've done so well, but everyone needs a bit of help sometimes. My father nodded in agreement. Exactly. With our experience, we could really help you elevate your business to the next level. And of course, we'd only need a small share of the profits, just enough to show our support. I stared at them in disbelief. They hadn't changed. The same people who had mistreated and belittled me, who saw me as nothing more than labor, were now eyeing a piece of my success. It was almost laughable. No, I said firmly, shaking my head. I'm not giving you any part of my business. Their smiles vanished as quickly as they had appeared. My father's face contorted with anger. After everything we did for you, you're going to turn your back on us? You ungrateful. Everything you did for me, I interrupted, my voice rising. You mean the years of abuse? How you treated me like dirt? You don't deserve credit for my success. I achieved this on my own despite you, not because of you. Silence fell, heavy with tension. Then my mother's voice cut through, cold and threatening. You'll regret this. We'll make sure of that. I stood up, heart pounding. I'm done here, I said, turning to leave. I should never have come back. As I walked out, my father's voice followed me. You haven't seen the last of us, boy. We'll take everything you have. I didn't look back. I drove away, trying to clear my mind of the encounter, but their words lingered. I didn't take their threat seriously at first. But a few weeks later, a letter arrived that sent a chill through me. It was from a lawyer, claiming my parents were suing me. They argued that they had laid the groundwork for my success and were entitled to a part of my company. The audacity of their lawsuit was overwhelming. I was both furious and frightened. They were actually trying to take everything I had worked so hard to achieve. I immediately called Sarah, Mike, and Dan to explain the situation. They were as shocked as I was, but promised to support me in any way possible. We quickly put together a legal team, ready to defend against the lawsuit. Despite our preparations, a persistent sense of dread hung over me. The lawsuit stretched on for months. In court, my parents portrayed themselves as victims, claiming they had sacrificed everything to provide for me and that I owed them for my success. It was all lies, but they presented their story convincingly. The case turned into a media spectacle, with headlines like Parents versus Son, the battle for a fortune dominating the news. Reporters constantly sought me out, eager for a sensational story. Meanwhile, my parents enjoyed the limelight, playing up their roles as wronged elders deserving of sympathy. It was exasperating, but our lawyers reassured us we had a solid case. Nevertheless, the stress was overwhelming. I struggled to concentrate on work, suffered from insomnia, and couldn't stop thinking about the lawsuit. Just when it seemed things couldn't get any worse, they did. One evening, while searching through old boxes for anything that might aid our case, I found an unmarked VHS tape. Curious, I found an old VCR and played the tape. The footage was shocking. Though grainy and clearly old, it unmistakably showed me as a child being repeatedly hit by my father with a glass bottle while I cried and pleaded for it to stop. My mother was there too, watching indifferently in the background. The video then switched to another scene, me as a younger child, laboring in the fields under my parents' harsh commands, threatening me to work faster. Watching the tape, long suppressed memories of my childhood resurfaced. I had tried so hard to bury these painful moments deep down, away from my current life. Watching the tape was like reliving my childhood horrors once again. A realization then struck me. This tape could be pivotal in winning the case. If I could prove the abuse, it would invalidate their claims and reveal their true nature. I immediately called Sarah, who had been helping me sort through the old boxes. You won't believe what I just found, I said, my voice shaking with both anger and relief. What is it? Sarah asked, her tone filled with concern. It's a tape, I explained, showing my parents abusing me. It captures everything. This could prove they're lying. After a brief silence, Sarah's voice firmed. We need to get this to the lawyers right away. This could change everything. The next day, we handed the tape over to our legal team, who were just as shocked, but also relieved. This was the evidence we needed to turn the tide in the case. When the tape was presented in court, the smug confidence of my parents vanished, replaced by panic and desperation. Their lawyer tried to dismiss the tape as irrelevant, but the judge allowed it to be shown. As the footage played, the courtroom fell into a stunned silence. When it ended, the judge looked at my parents with disgust and disbelief. "This is deeply disturbing," he said coldly. "In my career, I've seen many things, but this is particularly egregious." The parents' lawyer, looking deflated, mumbled about needing more time to review the evidence. The judge was uninterested. "I think we've seen enough," he declared. "This case should never have been brought to court." Then, unexpectedly, the lawyer appointed to represent my parents stood. "Your Honor," he began, his voice clear and determined, "I request to withdraw from this case. I cannot, in good conscience, continue to represent these individuals." The courtroom erupted into whispers and murmurs at his statement. My parents stared in shock as their lawyer announced his departure. "What are you doing?" my mother hissed, her face turning pale. The lawyer looked at them with cold disdain. "I'm done," he stated firmly. "I cannot represent people who have committed the acts you have." He then collected his papers and walked out of the courtroom, leaving my parents dumbfounded and silent. The judge, clearly disgusted by the whole ordeal, swiftly moved to close the case. "The court finds in favor of the defendant," he declared, his voice resonating with finality. "This case is closed." And just like that, the nightmare ended. But there was an unexpected twist still to come. As part of the judgment, the judge awarded me ownership of my parents' property, the farm where I had suffered so much. They had aimed to strip everything from me, but ironically, they were the ones left with nothing. I had no desire for the farm. It was a symbol of pain and misery, a reminder of all I had fought to leave behind. Yet I knew precisely what to do with it. I hired a team to dismantle the house piece by piece, every rotten board, every broken window, until all that remained was a pile of rubble. Then I sold the wood, the very essence of the farm reduced to a mere commodity. The irony was not lost on me. The place that had once imprisoned me was now just another resource, much like the wood my company processed daily. It was a fitting conclusion to a painful chapter of my life that I was eager to conclude. In the end, I didn't feel triumph or satisfaction, only a profound sense of relief. Those who had sought to ruin me were now powerless, and I was finally free to live my life as I chose. Watching the last of the wood being loaded onto a truck, ready to be repurposed, I took a deep breath and let go of the past. The future was now entirely in my hands. As I drove away from the empty lot where my childhood home once stood, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, lighter than I had been in years. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid. Having confronted and overcome my past, I felt stronger. Glancing in the rearview mirror, I watched the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky with strokes of orange and pink. It was breathtaking, a scene that felt like a promise of better days ahead. If you liked this story and want to see more, hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Your likes and subscriptions help us share more stories like this. Join us to keep watching and growing together. Thank you for your support.